Tēnā koutou katoa. Am I ready? All right. Te mea tūtahi, he mihi nui ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, Ngāti Whātua o Aorake. He mihi ki o rātou kaumātua, Hohepa Hawk. He mihi ki te whare tāhua e tūnei. He mihi ki ngā tangata mate, he mihi nui ki whae penny, moi mai rā. Apti hono tātai hono te hunga ora ki te hunga ora, apti hono tātai honga te hunga mate ki te hunga mate. Ki ngā tangata ora, he mihi nui ki whae Jane, rangatira o tēnei kaupapa, tēnā koe. Me tēnā koutou ki koutou katoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along on the Saturday to this wonderful hui. We're very lucky, so far as this panel is concerned, to have not 4 but 5 excellent panelists, each speaking from very diverse backgrounds and perspectives under the heading of reinvigorating the local. So to my left we have Jessie Chalmers, who's the co-owner of Chalmers Organics and Tonzu. Now, Jessie, I've just met you today, but it's fair to say that Tonzu is very close to my heart as a vegetarian and a trade unionist. Tonzu, of course, been a very early adopter of the living wage, and they set a great example for other organisations in what is traditionally quite a low-paying industry. So, kia ora. And Jessie will be speaking to the interface between small business and the issue of progressive trade policy. Next down the speaker roster we have Glenn Barclay, one of the National Secretaries of the Public Service Association of New Zealand, tēnā koe. We have Jen Despar, who for many of you will need no introduction, given her extensive work around the TPPA in Ōtautahi. She brings a great deal of expertise in community organising and in new economics or well-being economics, as we've discussed between ourselves as to quite how to define this somewhat elusive term of economists for those of us who are not economists in the university sense. We have Jessica Pallaret, who's the Education Vice President of the Auckland University Students Association and a final year law student under Professor Kelsey. Tēnā koe. And finally we have Tony Holman, QSO, who has had a long and esteemed career both in local government but also on various boards in the non-governmental sector. So we've got a wealth of experience here and a great deal of ground to cover. So to kick us off, let's go to Jessie, and perhaps if you could speak to your experience as a small business owner in New Zealand, and how you experience the trading environment and the trading policies which we live under now, and how that might change to make things easier for you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, everyone. It's a good turnout, and that's exciting that there's so many online viewers. So my name's Jessie Chalmers, and I'm co-owner of Chalmers Organics. So we're a food manufacturer based in West Auckland. We specialise in plant-based meat and dairy alternatives. As mentioned, we are a living wage employer, and we are a strong supporter of the living wage Aotearoa. So we've been in business for 24 years. My mum and father, Steve and Elizabeth, started the business a long time ago now. We not only manufacture, but we also market, sell, and do our own new product development in-house, so we're a little bit different to a lot of other businesses. We have 30 employees, and we're growing at 40 to 50% a year. We also have 800 domestic outlets and restaurants and cafes that stock our products. That's a little bit about what we do. As I mentioned, we are a living wage employer, which has yielded real economic benefits for our company. So our staff turnover rate is 3.5% versus the national average of 18.5%, which is creating real savings for our company. That's just there are more benefits than the financial ones, but it's good to talk about the really tangible stuff. So my partner also runs his own company. He's a residential building company, and he employs 8 young, hardworking New Zealand men. And as constant disappointment to me and somewhat of a surprise, they are really struggling in this so-called housing boom, especially in Auckland. It is a real tragedy, sometimes I find it a little bit hard to think about. So just to elaborate, so they're competing with foreign construction companies who import cheap labour, don't pay their staff in New Zealand or in New Zealand dollars. So this is a loophole for them to pay less than the minimum wage. So they not only export all their profits, they also don't pay in New Zealand. A lot of their employees are just here for 18 months. They just work 7 days a week, so they're not engaging in the community. They certainly have, so they are not at all concerned with the longevity of the New Zealand housing stock or the quality. So my partner, obviously, his company can't compete with these companies. Obviously, he pays a fair wage. And they are proud of the houses they build and of handing these off to New Zealand families who are going to live in them for hopefully a long time. So it's not only the wages, but it's also the quality of the homes. So Andrew can't compete with a company. Obviously, I'm not sure if people know, but more and more building companies are labour-only companies, so they no longer provide materials. And when labour is the entire overhead for the company, if someone's going to undercut you 60 to 70%, not only can they massively undercut you, they also can pull out more profit. So it's a bit of a double whammy for the industry. So unfortunately, as with the leaky homes, we are privatising the profits and in some cases sending them offshore and socialising the losses. So where local government and the New Zealand taxpayer is the insurer of last resort. The same can be said for low wages in the manufacturing industry. So we know big businesses traditionally pay the lowest wages, and the New Zealand taxpayer is subsidising their profits by providing, housing and low-wage subsidies. So people who are working 40 to 50 hours a week, I should say 60 to 70 to 80 hours a week, also can't support their families and live, well, certainly in Auckland anyway. So I guess one of the main issues with the current economic system is it assumes, purely from a domestic trade perspective, it assumes that a natural level of competition is maintained, and that is obviously categorically not at all the case in New Zealand. So just a couple of examples. Woolworths Australia purchased Woolworths New Zealand about 15 years ago, and that converted our entire grocery industry or system into a duopoly. So our experience has been with the big companies that they're far more willing to engage with small New Zealand businesses when they're under pressure from natural competition, and thus kind of keeping innovation and small New Zealand businesses alive. So they have a place, these big companies, but it is with competition and more of them. Obviously, there's also Fletcher's with the timber monopoly, more or less. So this year, Andrew tells me timber's going up again, 10-14%. Something along those lines, because they can get a better margin offshore, and some may say that's understandable, but unfortunately it leaves Kiwis in a position where it's becoming less and less viable to build your own home. I've got a lot to say about the building industry. Right, so
go for gold.
Obviously, over the next 2 decades. The world is going to change more than it probably has in at least written history. And New Zealand needs resilience to thrive in this environment. So depleting our local businesses and therefore local skills is not the way for us to remain resilient. So as far as international trade agreements goes, obviously when we are negotiating these, we must protect our local businesses, and that protects our communities, and it also keeps innovation alive, keeps us resilient, keeps us creative, keeps New Zealand in a good place. So it feels to us as a business that we're constantly fighting with the government as opposed to working together. For example, for us, the Ministry for Primary Industries hold us to rather stringent labelling requirements, which is fine, and it may seem like a technical kind of boring point to note, but it is kind of a silently rather expensive thing for us to maintain. So Any claim you make on a label, obviously you have to substantiate through testing, and that's okay. We're fully for that, but the same restrictions are not applied to any of our competition that's from overseas. And when that's pointed out, obviously they don't have the resources to do anything about it or the interest. It's just a small technicality, but there's many examples like that for us trading and following New Zealand's kind of food safety laws. So I guess for some time now it feels like there's no one ensuring New Zealand's domestic resilience, so unless you're a farmer, and the focus is still heavily on dairy and meat for New Zealand. So when organic and plant-based foods is the fastest growing food sector in the world by a long shot, and presents a much larger growth opportunity for New Zealand, as well as being far more sustainable in so many ways. So small businesses do take better care of the community than large businesses. We treat our employees better. I am proud and loud to say that because it's true. We provide services that larger companies don't and won't, simply because you can't upscale many small business models. Business owners throw longer hours into the work they do. They're more inspired by their own ideas and innovations. So yeah, most of the innovation comes from small businesses in New Zealand. So I guess I see the main challenges to be addressed over the next decade is how we support and protect our local businesses so they can thrive and help make New Zealand more resilient, meaning cultivating skills, sustainable practices to fortify us for the big, I guess, coming changes and the potential for massive climate change and the turbulent socio-economic times that may follow that. Yeah.
Kia ora. Thank you very much for that, Jessie, and no doubt myself and members of the audience will have questions for you later on. Moving on now to Glenn. Auntie Jane, in all of her wisdom and preparedness, provided a series of questions to help the participants in the panel gather their thoughts. Well, in actual fact, Glenn has adhered to them rather stringently. So I'm going to read those out by way of context, so people are aware of that. And Glenn's prepared a presentation, which I understand falls largely along those lines. So the 4 questions are: what main challenges can you foresee that need to be addressed now, in 10 and in 30 years' time, with respect to your area of interest and expertise? What is the international dimension of these challenges that needs to be addressed in an economic agreement with other countries? What principles should underpin how those challenges are addressed? And are there specific rules you think should be in an international economic agreement? So with that, Glenn Barclay.
Thank you, Stephen. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Glenn Barclay Takaunga. I'm as Stephen said, one of the National Secretaries of the PSA, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to do a quick promo. We're growing as a union at a rapid rate, and we're very close to cracking 68,000 members. When I first joined the PSA in 2003, I think it was, we had about 42,000, so it's an exciting time. Just by way of background, because I'm here to talk about public services, our members are predominantly in the public service, but we've got large numbers of members in the district health boards, large numbers of members in the wider state sector. We're the largest union in local government, and also a significant player in the community sector. We're delivering public services through community organisations. Having said all that, Stephen, in the few moments since you were talking to me back there, I've changed my mind. I'm sort of roughly going to follow the questions, but only roughly. What I wanted to comment on for a start is just there's been a lot of comment about the nation state, effectively, over the last 2 days. It remains the main bulwark we've got against some of the worst things that we see in the international trade arena. So for all its flaws, and God knows it's got plenty, it is still the most important tool we have. And of course that's very true in relation to public services. I also would just, by way of opening statement as well, saying I've thought about this both in terms of our domestic policies, how we think about public services, which I think is every bit as important as what we think international agreements should or should not do and in relation to public services. And then lastly, another opening comment, which is that this theme of this is reinvigorating the local. And in New Zealand, where it's not unique, I guess, but it's still reasonably unusual in that central government delivers the bulk of public services in New Zealand, which is not true of the UK, Australia, lots of places in Europe, US, and so on. So those are important things just to note before we kick off. In terms of the challenges that I can foresee, well, I think most people know what they are. They're the challenges that public services around the world are grappling with. Climate change is the obvious one. The importance of public services, both in terms of emergency response and the public services that can assist the just transition, whether it's through income support, retraining, even the provision of social order in difficult times. So the state and public services has got a huge role to play there. Inequality, poverty, housing, health, education, those core social issues, the state, as others have clearly stated in the last few days, has absolutely got a critical role to play in the delivery of those public services. Provision of decent work, the public services has got a huge responsibility there, not just in how we regulate the employment market and the economic settings, but also the state as an employer needs to be a leader. We need to have full employment. We need to have jobs that are well paid, that there's no gender or ethnic pay gap, that the work is secure. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've got a particular issue, particular challenge in how we make sure we honour te tiriti in how we deliver public services and across the country. So, just putting aside, I know there are other issues, but those are all pretty big ones. And thinking about public services themselves and the challenges facing public services. And I'll start with one which is not unique to New Zealand, which is how do we change how people think about public services? And we are living, the last 30, 40 years within the neoliberal paradigm in which the individual and individual choice has been put over and above the collective, the ability for us to respond to complex problems as a collective, and the need to support each other. We have to somehow change that narrative. But on top of that narrative, there's been another narrative, which is a lack of trust in government, which I think goes together with that neoliberal paradigm. That as government is increasingly brought into that individualistic approach that it's not so much our problem, it's your problem, and so on. That people have become frustrated with public services and lost trust, and then you get something like the global financial crisis, in which we know is a massive failure of international capital, but has been portrayed by many people as a failure of governments, and deficits that arose as a consequence of that helped erode government trust. And then the last nail in the coffin is the people like Trump, who have deliberately set out to attack and undermine public institutions. I think we're relatively fortunate in this country. We haven't had the worst of those kind of excesses, but nonetheless, and the example you gave, Marilyn, of change on Farm Act back in 2009 is one example of the kind of questioning that still has arisen here. So that's a big and huge issue for public services. Technology is a huge challenge for public services, and so far public services are mostly grappling with it in terms of how do we deliver our services online and stuff. But at the same time, listening again to speakers yesterday, we know that government agencies are big advertisers on Facebook. We know that one of the big challenges I think that we're going to face in the future is the platform approach to delivering services, and not just in terms of employment, but there's a platform that's out there at the moment called MyCare. I don't know if anyone's heard of this. It's been We spent a lot of energy in the community sector last year getting equal pay for care and support workers and getting guaranteed hours. And now MyCare is this privately run platform which has come into the care and support sector and enables willing workers to be put in touch with people with disabilities or elderly people in their home to find the person they want, completely outside of the arrangements that exist. So that's a major challenge for us. It's a locally owned vehicle at the moment, but who's to say that in a few years' time it won't be taken over by a multinational with all that goes with, and the model could be applied by a multinational just as easily. And then there's a big challenge for the state and for public services to respond to the challenges of te tiriti, which I mentioned before. So looking from those challenges to what we can do, and this is where I look at both the domestic and the international. So looking at how public services themselves need to respond. The first is that we need to have a default that public services should be funded and owned by the public with no privatisation and no PPPs. And we're fortunate that PPPs, although they're in our schools, and we've got one major prison built under PPP, that it's not as bad as it has been, or pervasive as it has been in places like Australia. We need to prevent the marketisation of services, and we're still dealing with the funder-provider split, which was inherent in the reforms of the 1980s. So by marketisation of services, if you think back to the 1990s when ACC was, we called it privatised, but really what they did is they privatised the market so that competitors could come in and compete with ACC. And that, of course, immediately and fundamentally undermines the public good element of ACC. And with the funder-provider split, we saw that with the health reforms of the 1990s, where the state said it doesn't matter who delivers health services, provided that they're delivered and we'll fund whoever, which fortunately the plug was pulled on that, but we still have in many of aspects of our public services that funder-provider split. And we need to think before we corporatise public services. Public corporations were set up in the late 80s as a stepping stone to privatisation. A number of those were pulled back from that, and we've had to renationalise one or two, as you are well aware. But they're vulnerable, and we need to ensure foreign companies pay their fair share of tax. We need to introduce a public interest test before we contract out any services in the future. And we need, and this goes to the trust issue, we need to ensure that public sector workers, our members and citizens, have real influence in the development of public policy and the way in which public services are delivered. So we need to, it's not just enough to say don't privatise, here's the ring fence to stop corporatisation and international companies coming in, but we need, as public services, to rethink how we behave in order to help rebuild that trust around collective action. And we need to put te tiriti in the State Sector Act, or whatever legislation supersedes the State Sector Act, and we need to ensure that public services are working with Māori as partners while providing culturally safe workplaces for Māori to work. And there are some developments that give me a degree of optimism in that space. The risk around that is, of course, that it raises expectations that will be dashed, but there are conversations in the realm of the state sector reform processes that are going on at the moment that offers some hope. And so then to the trade agreements aspect of all of this. So I mean, what I'm saying with all of this is that if our public services are configured in ways that make them vulnerable to privatisation and corporates coming in, well then that's a problem. So we have to look to ourselves first, but then we have to look to the agreements. And I don't have much in the way of original ideas because I've heard lots of fantastic ideas in the last 2 days, and every time I thought of something, I thought someone else would get up and say it, but that's okay. I really like the good global governance stuff that was being talked about yesterday, and that we as affiliates of Public Services International, those global union federations have got a role to play in trying to ensure that happens. We need to ensure that agreements have the lens on the public good rather than the good of private investors. And the notion of a public interest test before privatisation is the kind of thing you could build into agreements, or at least in terms of our expectations of what our negotiators are going to do. And I liked very much what Louise was saying in terms of us having hard expectations laid down that governments would have to adhere to in entering into agreements. There needs to be genuine recognition of the place of te tiriti and Indigenous people in those agreements, and agreements that hold corporates to account, not just governments. And lastly, there's just one thing that I learned from Donald Trump via George Monbiot, which was that it's a good idea, if you've got agreements, that they have sunset clauses or review clauses. That what was his comments about NAFTA actually rang true, which is that something that was created in a particular time with a particular agenda, that agenda might no longer hold true after a period of time. Why not stop and take stock and have that written in? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Len. Now, from quite a different perspective, Gender Spa, who, as I said before, is a very active community campaigner with a strong interest in alternative or new economics, which I guess flies below the radar of a lot of what's talked about in trade agreements, at the state level. Would you be able to speak to what you perceive as the issues challenging local community organising and how that intersects with trade policy in the wider economy?
Kia ora, Stephen. He mihi nui ki ngā mana whenua o te rohi nei, Ngāti Whātua o Rakei. Kia ora koutou katoa. I think in direct answer to that question, one of the things that we need to be careful about with trade agreements is to make sure that rules that are in there to regulate on various things, like we're wanting to have regulations on financial markets and things like that, but we need to make sure that they don't also impact on community organising of different forms of economic new economic sort of things. So, for example, and this isn't, this is kind of just in the same kind of way, laws around health and safety, for example, that have gone kind of a little bit overboard, have caused after-school care programs to have difficulty in having the parents of kids come in and give afternoon teas to these kids, because everybody now needs to be police checked if they're going to be anywhere near a child. So it means that we are stopping communities from being able to look after children because we've got these over-exertive rules on health and safety. So we just need to be careful in our trade agreements that we don't go and do that in the same way to these small operations that are growing up in local communities. So just to kind of step back and give you an idea of where I'm coming from, I got very, very involved in the campaign on the ground to raise awareness about the TPP, and it was quite easy to get a lot of motivation from people on the ground because it was so obvious that there were so many problems with it. So I did everything in that realm, from handing out flyers to people, to organising public meetings and educating people about it, to writing submissions and making submissions to parliamentary select committees. We walked to Parliament from Christchurch as part of our campaign, and most recently chained myself to a train track. So, kind of everything in the realm of that sort of legal means of protesting or lobbying about these things. And was incredibly disappointed around the results of what happened when, after campaigning for a change of government who we thought were hopefully going to go the right way on the TPP and then didn't. It was terribly disappointing after putting in 4 years of intense energy into that. So I felt quite depressed around that time and was wondering, really, is this where I want to put my energy? Sort of into these things which are so high level that to somebody who isn't working at that high level of government and sort of international agreements and stuff, it seems like really, can you make any difference? And so before I had become enlightened to what trade agreements, what was going on with the TPP and things like that, I was a paramedic for St John in Auckland, and in the process of that job, I became really, really aware of what the consequences of broken communities actually looks like. So there's all sorts of problems. We heard from the health experts about the social determinants of health, and as an ambulance officer, you are really absolutely the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And you're also seeing, one side of, all sides of life. You might go from a job in South Auckland right to your next job in Parasite Drive. So I became aware, I left Auckland and moved to another job back down, which is my sort of spiritual homeland, Golden Bay, the top of the South Island, Nelson region. And it was during this time that I stumbled across this idea of time banking. And to me, after being in Auckland for 3 years on ambulance, thinking about these problems all the time, why was the ambulance service going to jobs that weren't emergency jobs? The idea of time banking became very clearly obvious to me, how the ambulance service, St John Ambulance Service, could use time banking as a volunteer reward system, but also with the longer term process of knitting communities back together, which would eventually reduce resource use. So I've been working on that for quite some years, but it's got me into all these other new economic ideas as well. So, for example, community land trusts, which take property out of the market economy, and the land is held by the community land trust and the house is owned by the person who lives in it, for example. And this doesn't need to be all on the same land. We don't have to live in a commune to do this. It could be hundreds of houses across Auckland, for example. Savings pools I'm very much involved with at the moment, so we talk about reciprocity. So instead of paying interest on loans, a savings pool pays reciprocity. So for example, if I borrow $5,200 to buy a new car from my savings pool, who are a group of people who share their money, and that particular amount of money is because it's easy maths for me, so I can pay it back at $100 a week. What will actually happen is I'll pay $100 a week over 2 years. And so I pay back my $5,200 that I've borrowed from you, my savings pool, and then I pay back another $5,200 over the same amount of time, so that any of you have the opportunity to use that money as well. And at the end of that payback period, that money is mine. It's my money that I've saved. So we're working with savings pools. We're paying off mortgages now, although that's not that easy. So we're doing lots of pool loans. And when you pull all of these things together and get them working in unison, like instead of a time bank here and a savings pool there and a community land trust over there and a social enterprise over there, you get them all working together. So for example, at the moment, I'm initiating a small native forest restoration project, and we are going into business doing school camps in that place, and so we're borrowing money in a savings pool style to borrow the money to buy the business. We're going to pay that back, and the money on top of that, my reciprocity, will be available for time banks to be able to seed fund their own social enterprises so that they can fund themselves rather than always having their hand out to grant organisations, so they don't have to waste this time applying for funding. So once you start getting all of these sort of new economic ideas actually working in unison, then you have a different whole framework for how this can work. So mutual aid networks, which work in the States, or were originated in the States, have been working with youth justice programs, and they're actually looking now at tendering for the rights to do adult justice services, so even looking into the prison industrial complex and how they can start running those. So what I'm saying about new economics is that there are loads of ideas and working models actually happening throughout the world, and my feeling is that there is no doubt that we need to change the economic system that we've had. It is taking us to the brink of total collapse. I don't think we have very much time left to play around, and so we have to actually start creating these new systems and seeing if they work, like playing with them, experimenting with them, and tweaking them until they do work. The challenges that we're going to face, now, it's the inability of people to recognise that we are in serious crisis right now. And so in 10 and 30 years, if we have that long, it's going to be serious climate change, looking at what we're going to do. So we have to get our food system sorted out. And as we were told in the pōwhiri yesterday, kai is one of the things that has always been traded. And so to reinvigorate our local trading loops is really important. And that's what these trade agreements, international trade agreements, take away from us, because we get all these cheap shoes from China or wherever it came from. Christchurch used to have 12 shoe manufacturing businesses. It now has none, pretty much. I think there might be one safety boot company that still operates. But so we have these advantages for consumers with cheap stuff, but those consumers are also workers, and now their work is gone. And so how can you consume that stuff? So we need to be viewing food and agriculture as more than just a commodity, because actually there's all sorts of social advantages that we can get. Purposeful work, looking after our soils, feeding our people, and coming together in local communities over food is one of the greatest ways to bring us together. So just in closing, the principles that we need to work with are already there. They're already out there for us. I think Kate Raworth's Donut Economics and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance has got the answers there for us about the principles that we need to look at when we're thinking about any kind of economic future, and particularly our trade agreements.
Kia ora, Jen, that was great. And look, I've definitely got a lot of questions that I want to ask about that, but I'll keep moving down the roster. So next up is Jessica Pallaret, as I said before, Education Vice President at the University of Auckland Students Association. One of the comments that came out yesterday what was mentioned a few times was the 7-generation principle, the idea that, you know, the actions that we undertake as a society should be geared towards not undermining the existence of 7 generations from now. As a society now, particularly so far as our trading arrangements are concerned, it seems that we're not doing a particularly good job of thinking even of the next generation. You know, rangatahi have more to lose than anybody from a poorly managed global trading system or local trading system. And I wonder, Jessica, what your thoughts are as to what the alternative might be.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Just as a starting note, I think it's kind of funny being asked to present the rangatahi perspective on trade, because I think there is no one perspective. And so I'm sort of going to give my own, and I know that that is different from a whole heap of other people's. I have some friends who are vehement opposers of the TPP and others who are really in favour of it. And so I think just as a starting point, that's sort of the context that I'm coming from. And so within that, I thought, well, what's the key messages that I think are existing in our current agreements and global trade arrangements, and what are the key kind of failures and challenges that I think exist in those agreements that will affect my generation moving forward and 7 generations from now that I don't think people are paying enough attention to. And I think that I've got 3 particular areas that I'm going to highlight, and I think that they need to form the basis of the way that we think about trade moving forward and should be priority areas when we are discussing what agreements might come in the future. And it was interesting because the first one I was wanting to talk about is the environment, which is something that's already been talked about by this panel and at this conference quite a lot. But this is one of the biggest issues facing my generation and generations to come. And we know that, you know, the ICCP report that came out last week that really highlighted how grave a situation we're in. And it's really frustrating sitting here and looking at what our global leaders are doing and just knowing that it's not enough and people aren't caring enough about it. And I think that the key in my mind to combating climate change sits in what the international community does together. But then there's a very interesting intersection between, say, the Paris Peace Agreement and, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and it was totally wrong, interesting intersection between that and international trade agreements. And so if we think of the CPTPP, they actually did have a section on the environment, and I won't try to speak super cogently on this area, as I know many people in this room could probably do so better than me. But although there was a section on the environment in that agreement, it really fell short of what is actually needed. I don't think that it really committed any country to anything concrete, and all of those principles around environmental protection can be trumped by corporate interests, and also just trumped by the fact that there's nothing tying countries at the moment to real action on climate change. And that's why it's so easy for the states just to pull out and change their opinion on whether climate change even exists, and have real no backlash as a result of that can enforce change. So I think that the relationship between the environment and trade agreements needs to be much, much stronger, particularly because commerce has such an effect on the environment and the way that people conduct business, and the way that has such a catastrophic impact on the environment when people pursue profit at the expense of environmental protection. And so I think that's one of the key challenges that I think trade agreements need to focus on much, much better. Related to that, of course, is investor-state dispute settlement clauses, which I'm sure have also been talked about a lot. But it's interesting, I think it's something like 70% of all legal action from investor-state dispute settlement clauses have come from climate action. And the government's currently working towards its Zero Carbon Act. And I think that the risk of investor-state dispute settlement clauses within that context is incredibly damaging and not something that should be in the agreements that we sign ourselves up to when we are looking about the impacts that this will have for decades to come. Moving then on to a second issue, and I think that this issue is around looking at a global world and the increasing impact of globalisation. Because in a sense, that's exactly what trade agreements are trying to do, connect up different countries. But I think that there are a couple of things that people miss often when they're talking about trade agreements. And I think the first one is, at least from the media discourse that I've seen, is all very sort of New Zealand, New Zealand, New Zealand. And everyone just talks about impacts of trade agreements on New Zealand. And I think that what's really missing in the media in particular is a discussion of what trade agreements mean for Pacific Islands, for developing countries. What did the TPP mean for Vietnam, for example? And I think that the discourse around a very New Zealand-centric idea of what trade agreements mean is quite damaging. But then the second part to that as well, is how trade agreements are formed even more broadly, because when you have the WTO, who I think have a decreasing level of power in terms of how trade agreements are even happening, and what that means for the future moving forward, is I think you have an increasingly strong US and China, and their ability to wield power in the international environment with regards to trade, I think undermines the sort of power of the WTO in quite a dangerous way as well. And looking sort of generations ahead, something that's key in the way that trade agreements are made, I think, is democratic decision making, which best comes from the WTO, but yet the WTO's power is declining as the process that it engages in is just so glacial that it's very hard for them to actually do very much. So I think that actually looking at how we can strengthen the WTO, rather than necessarily focusing on all these agreements sort of in between states and the kind of multi-regional agreements, I think is really important, looking at the global community as a whole and how trade agreements can sort of help the world moving forward in decades to come. The final principle that I wanted to talk about is around transparency. And from a young people's perspective, I started thinking about this because young people are not really engaged in trade, and that we're affected by it, but we're never around the decision-making table. And this is then exacerbated by the fact that the actual process for trade negotiations is very sort of non-transparent, and I think there are massive issues around that. So the lack of parliamentary oversight, for example, the lack of information that we have around what happens behind closed doors in those trade negotiating rooms, I think has a particularly bad effect on young people who are never going to be inside those rooms. So the only way that young people can properly be engaged by the process is if those processes are opened up and people are told about them and what's happening. I understand the arguments against having a very transparent trade process, but I think that there is some sort of middle ground that isn't really talked about enough. I think that the debate around transparency is very bipolar. I think there's a middle ground that's particularly important for young people because of the lack of representation and engagement that we have within the process. I think that those 3 points are the ones that I really wanted to stress in terms of the challenges particularly facing young people. I know there are a lot more, but I don't have all day. But one final thing that I thought I'd talk about, given this topic is around reinvigorating the local, is what we can be doing to engage young people more in discussions about trade. And the first thing to say is I actually think lots of young people do care quite a lot. I mean, the TPP protests were filled with young people passionate about trade issues. And to the extent that young people aren't, I think that actually is a broader issue, largely around actually civics education and how involved we make young people in politics and political issues much more generally than just what it means for trade. So in terms of how to engage young people, I think that probably should start at schools, and we should change the way that we talk about politics and political issues in civics. But then secondly, I think trade is often seen as a very vague, high level and not very tangible, particularly discussions around young people. Biggest discussions generally are around corporations, for example, which is just not something that I think young people necessarily are like, oh yeah, that really is speaking to me as something that I need to care about. And so the way that you actually frame your messages and actually frame it as this maybe 7th-generation kind of issue, I think would be much more powerful when speaking to young people, because we have immense amount of power as young people, and I promise that young people care. It's just about speaking to them in a way that makes them know that they should care and makes them want to do that themselves. Yeah.
Well, kia ora. And Jessica, so I'm not putting you on the spot in 5 minutes or 5 or 10 minutes time. I'm going to pose a question for you to now to perhaps think about, because certainly throughout the long campaign against the TPPA and its later manifestations, it was unpredictable when, rangatahi and young people would engage. But, I mean, sometimes we would call a protest and, we'd end up with a whole bunch of high school kids and it was fantastic. And sometimes you had the same old suspects, from the Springbok tour showing up, and, it was never, I don't think any of us really quite got to the bottom of what were the issues that engaged young people. And so if you could perhaps reflect on, how we could talk about this in the future, that would be really helpful.
I can say one quick comment on that now, which is that if I had an answer for how to engage young people more, I promise AUSA and all students' associations would be a hell of a lot more powerful. So I wish that I had the answer for that, but I can come back to it later.
Yeah, I appreciate we're putting you on the spot, having to represent all young people to this hui. All right, so next up, our final presenter is Tony Holman, who I've introduced earlier. Tony prefaced his presentation to me earlier saying he was a little bit nervous about potentially issuing some controversial statements. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. Tony, the floor is very much yours.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm standing up because my posterior is somewhat uncomfortable, having sat here for several days. I can also see that gravity is having an effect on some eyelids. So could I suggest that any who feel that way inclined, and a couple have already been standing up, more of you, if you want to stand up, won't concern me unless you're making for the door, in which case I can go home earlier. Sorry about my voice, I've had a flu on and off for most of the year, I think. And Jane, you issued a challenge to the speakers here in this panel, saying you hoped that they would respond to your 4 questions. Broadly, well, I have. Broadly, my challenge to you is, are you going to be able to find out where I've put them? Right, reinvigorating the local government, our local government and communities. How do we reinvigorate local authorities and empower local communities in the future that's being scoped in these various talks we've been having? And Jane, by the way, thank you for what you've done, you and your friends, and keeping on about trade issues in particular. As soon as possible, in my view, local government must be made really local in terms of area, character and cohesiveness. And it must also have full responsibility for and designated and defined local matters. The model must be fully democratic and its responsibilities independent of central government. The model must not, can I say it again, not be a corporate or commercial style bureaucracy along the lines of the current Auckland Council, which in my view is a huge anti-local, anti-democratic body, the opposite of all that local government is supposed to be. To ensure that local government and local communities are appropriately empowered and protected, New Zealand needs a well-constructed formal constitution. Now that's the first thing that may cause a few gulps, but that's my belief that's the answer to several things, some of which you've been concentrating on all through this discussion. Possibly along the lines of the Swiss Confederation, where there are defined constitutional safeguards for local authority areas, which of course are called cantons there. And the councils and citizens of those areas have clear rights of self-determination in their areas, which cannot be changed by central government without a nationwide referendum requiring 2/3 majority of voters agreeing to any such changes. Now that is direct democracy, which is something that hasn't spread very far, and I think it's time it did. Among other things, It helps to provide major stability for local bodies and local communities and protects them from arbitrary changes to their local government, which we see endlessly in New Zealand, where powers, functions and costs can be altered at the whim of Parliament. Such a system, I believe, and having talked to some Swiss people in Switzerland, I believe has strengthened the communities, and it fosters active participatory democracy, not a dying and cynical one, which is developing in New Zealand. And it's interesting that this panel here has ended up with one of the youngest speakers in this forum and one of the oldest speakers. But I really appreciated what you said, and particularly the last part about how we need to get democracy discussed in our schools, and the elements and the structures and the mechanics of democracy. And until that happens, I don't think we're going very far. The principles required to underpin this dual governmental system include acceptance by the people that central government has to respect the right of people to self-determination in local matters through their local councils. That would require Parliament to consult local government about any international or trade agreements, with local government being able to reject any proposals that limit its constitutional rights. And I emphasise that local government would have specific local government rights. In the Swiss model, changes, as I've mentioned, to the constitution and powers of either sector of government must be subject to a compulsory referendum of all citizens. In the international context, any trade agreements should include such matters as the protection of human rights, the environment, the treaty, and democratic institutions, to name a few. I would hope that this hui will also be pushing for an international agreement requiring real free trade and free trading, and to set a timetable for the elimination of specific trade agreements such as TPPA, GATS, and the China-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. Some of what I heard yesterday seemed to be focusing on current institutions and looking at some modifications. I may have misheard, but that's how it came across to me. It seemed that this was losing focus on the aim of this hui, of an alternative and progressive trade strategy. Aren't most of these institutions the products or tools of the trade systems that have grown up over the last several decades and together have brought us here today, like WTO? Sorry to mention that, but I think it's had its day. I think we also need to decide what we are talking about when we refer to free trade. Do we want to push for fair trade, or try to enunciate it? Or equitable trade, as I heard this morning, maybe another good term. Do we need to declare our version of trade agreements which clearly state the conditions under which we are ready to trade? One speaker suggested yesterday, we can't take sides, while another suggested that we need to be able to pick up the bits that we want and not moving into areas or things we don't want. I think Mr. Rosenberg is still with us. One speaker also, it was Rod Oram who also referred to the current free trade illusion, which of course is what it is. We've termed it quite wrongly. We've been brainwashed. Local government and central government must not be exposed or vulnerable to interventions or challenges by foreign companies, multinationals, or by agreements such as GATS or PPTA or the China Agreement. Nor should international treaties conflict with a constitution, which I hope we will skillfully guide ourselves to in the next 10 or 20 years, Jane. These points take me back to the Swiss example, which is one of neutrality. And I think that's something that should be in our constitution if we ever get one. Neutrality. Countries should be free to trade with whomsoever they choose, and no country or conglomerates should be accorded special powers or access to disputes tribunals, which I think we all agree on, or demand conditions which undermine the rights of the intended trade partner. The government of this country needs the backup of a robust constitution to bolster its trading principles and its trading positions. And it needs to do that to protect the citizens and give them a certainty that they will be protected. In conclusion, it is my firm belief that to have an appropriate and reinvigorated community or communities and relevant local government, we must have a new, well-balanced, dual system of government in this country. We must get rid of the current system which creates instability, unnecessary costs, unfair parliamentary delegation of tasks to local government with impacts and costs to local communities. Central government often forces things on local government, sometimes because it simply doesn't want to deal with the issues or the costs. So I look forward to a formal New Zealand Constitution that will promote these improvements and give protection to our local government, our central government, and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tony. Look, I'm very conscious of the time, and having said that, I still want to hear a little bit more out of some of the panellists. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions from the floor, but hopefully this will be interesting. And because we're competing with the prospect of coffee in the immediate future, and we're competing with the clock, if we can keep the answers very, very snappy and quick, that'd be fantastic. So, Jess, in 50 words or less, what do we need to do to get rangatahi engaged around issues of trade and creating a better trading framework?
Yeah, so in addition to the things I was talking about before, I think the key message I'd give to anyone trying to engage in with young people is not to talk at young people, but to talk with them. And I think the most effective thing to do is to make sure that you have young people in your organising teams and are empowering them in your own organisations to help you develop the movements that talk best with young people. And the other part of that is there are lots of really strong youth communities in New Zealand, very strong organisations that I think you should also tap into, as there are lots and lots of passionate young people who I think actually would care a lot about trade if they were empowered and given the information to do it, and could be really strong advocates on this scene. So that's probably my number one piece of advice.
Got it. Thank you for that. All right, Jen, one of the beautiful things about mutual aid networks and alternative economic practices is you don't need to ask permission from the state if anybody else is do it yourself, right? Which is wonderful. It's empowering, whereas, tying yourself to train tracks to try to, change the mind of a recalcitrant government around, neoliberal orthodoxy is perhaps not so empowering. But we live in a world where, we have a very strong central state. We have capital owning everything. We have regulations at the state and international level. What do you think the state could do to facilitate more grassroots developments of the type that you've talked about?
Well, one of the things that we are looking at immediately is to try and get time banking recognised by the IRD and WINS, so that it is tax-free, and for WINS that it is actually seen as a beneficial thing for people on benefits to undertake and get involved in. So those are the kinds of things that immediately, because time banking is not the answer to everything, but it is something that it's easy for people to grasp the idea that everybody's hour is equal, of equal value, which is a complete change to the current paradigm. So easy things like that, I think, would go a long way to helping people understand that this monetary system is not the only economic system.
Got it. All right. So moving on to Glenn. Glenn, one of the, I guess, the key themes I picked out of your presentation was the tendency within the neoliberal orthodoxy that we exist in now to have what have traditionally been state services now competing with the market, whether through a funding and delivery split or whether through out-and-out privatisation. And there's a tough question, so I apologise in advance, but if there were to be one policy intervention which would go some way to remedying that, I'm talking about the low-hanging fruit here, that you would like to see, what would that be?
It is difficult to give you the one thing because there's a whole framework of reforms that have created the environment that we're in. I guess, in fact, any given government at a particular time has the ability, without radically changing the law, to say we're going to introduce a public interest test, and that's it. We'll go with the public interest test because I think. It won't fundamentally change the dynamics of the legislative framework, but a public interest test will cause agencies to stop and think, and it will change the dynamic. And hopefully, over time, we'll see more services brought back in house.
Got it. Thank you very much. And finally, Jesse, you talked about in your presentation, and this was really striking to me. I'd never thought of this before. The disconnect between, on one hand, you having to meet very stringent standards when producing food products for the market, but at the same time having to compete with imported products where the same testing standards simply aren't applied. So in a sense, it's an unfair playing field that you're operating on. Once upon a time, in New Zealand and in countries around the world, local producers were protected through, by income, by tariff protections at the border, to sort of maintain the competitiveness of small and local businesses. Of course, these days, this is defined as protectionism, and people, run to the hills when they hear the word. But what's your view as a small business owner of the idea of protecting the viability and the profitability of small businesses at the border?
Ooh, that's topical. Competition is good, and products come in from offshore, and they do provide competition for New Zealand businesses, and they keep you sharp. And I am not against that necessarily. Tariffs are tricky. There are a lot of New Zealand businesses that export, and obviously likewise would be penalised, or they actually are penalised in the States and other countries for that. So I think it's probably there's probably no simple answer, and it's probably industry by industry. But for us, we're undercut constantly by international companies, and we are very strong in New Zealand and very competitive and very motivated. So we are doing okay, and we're at a size where we are a bit more flexible. But small businesses, they just simply can't compete. And I think it's probably unrealistic for the smaller industries to ever have a voice enough for government to put tariffs on products that come in. It's a little bit unrealistic. So I don't know. I don't really know the answer. I think for the building industry, tariffs is so far out of the conversation that it's not even really a subject. There's so many other issues to tackle before you even got anywhere near that. So I think industry by industry it's different probably.
Right, thank you for that. And thanks very much again to all the panellists today. It's been a great conversation.
And my thank you to you all as well, because you've kept everyone engaged here in the penultimate part of the hui. But I also want to do a big shout out to out there, because the latest numbers we have was 9,000 yesterday. That's 9,000 different addresses that actually logged in, if I understand the way it was described to me. 9,000 yesterday, 4,000 by midday today. So by the time we end the hui, we should have been about 15 to 17,000 people who have watched this conversation, which is about the local engaging with these questions. So now we can have a cuppa, and what we're going to do is Barry Coates is going to take us through the last session. It would be great if you could stay. We're going to try to make it as diverse and interactive as we can, so please stick around. And Barry, did you have any did we come up with, yes, tweeting? Do you want to get people to think, who are out there, thinking about the tweety thing now? I don't tweet, I don't Facebook, so Barry has to do it.
So we're very aware that there are people who aren't necessarily going to be part of our tea and coffee break. So if you're online, what we're going to be doing is having a discussion around where we take this from here, and feeding back kind of our ideas. We'll form some groups to discuss this stuff. But if you're online, do take some time while we're taking this break to set out some of your ideas, and if you can put them down on Twitter on hashtag alt, A-L-T, trade, alt trade, then that will help provide some feed in to us, and then we'll kind of reconnect with you in 10 minutes at 10 to 4. Okay, so 10 minutes, 10 coffee break.